be the technologies that are going to allow us to reduce carbon, and how do we trade those off against the benefits? And they estimated that we should try to stabilize carbon near somewhere near 450 to 550 parts per million. So this, I think, exercise is useful because this was an enormously ambitious project with hundreds of economists. It was like a 1,000-page thing. But they really, I mean, in some ways, we're only scratching the surface of the problem. And there's all sorts of things that could cause problems for it. So one that James was talking about is these like tail events, various catastrophic things. But to the extent that those are the most important, which I think that they might actually be some of the most important causes, the possibility that, I don't know if anyone's sort of geoengineering, but it's these ways that you can sort of like, by putting particles into the atmosphere or doing various other things, reduce the amount of global warming. And the possibility of doing that, well, that's not a very attractive thing to do. At least it's not horrifically bad. So if that's available to us, like if some really terrible things start happening and we can do that, that can cut off some of the lower tail events and thereby really reduce some of the potential worst harms that could occur, replacing them with a merely bad harm. Okay, so the Stern review focuses on sort of hard economic costs, and it leaves out things like, do people like being warmer, cooler, with more rain, less rain, et cetera? And while that sounds frivolous, or like small potatoes, think about how much more expensive it is to live in San Francisco than it is to live in Chicago. Is that because San Francisco is such a cooler city? Probably not. It's probably because there's a lot better weather in San Francisco, right? How much do people care about the animals that are killed off because of climate change? It has the potential to cause mass extinctions. How should we value that? What's the value we should place on civilizations or cities that are destroyed beyond the people within them, right? And lots of people have private knowledge about how much changing climate is going to affect their ability to grow crops. And how are we supposed to incorporate that? I don't know. So all of these share that science and expertise are not enough. We need to actually know something about people's private willingness to pay. And that's true for a broad range of cases. So subjective existence values of environments or cultures can be assessed by an expert, but many people think that an expert's judgment is not enough. We actually need to know how much people are willing to pay for those things. Personally or privately valued property or consumption often has an idiosyncratic component to it that's driven by the details of people's individual tastes, and not just by the market value of that property. If I've been living somewhere a long time, if my grandma lived there too, it may have a lot of value to me. And if that's destroyed, it may be much more costly to me than just what the market value of that land is. And finally, local information about technology and its impacts on, local information about technology and all the other things that Hayek was talking about might really affect how much people are hurt by something like climate change or any other big global externality. So when such information, such local private information is genuinely important, we try to elicit that by getting people to tell us how much their value are for these things, right? And the goal of this, I want to make clear, is not because how much you value something is just like the definition of how much it's worth. So for example, if I went to someone in Africa and said to them, how much is it worth to you to reduce carbon emissions, they probably wouldn't even know what you were saying. And they certainly wouldn't be able to do a very good job of projecting that without a lot of scientific training. But if you ask them, how much is it worth to you that the temperature rises this much, that's something they might have a better sense for. So the goal in these things is to elicit information, not just to say that, like, by definition, we have to go with whatever people's valuations are in order to determine the thing. We're trying to get the information from them that we can't get more effectively in some other matter. So, for example, when we think about the inherent value of cultures, you could ask the question, does this come from how much individuals value other cultures existing, like how much are you willing to pay in me? Or is this something that is valued by society as a whole? Depending on which one of those standards you think is more appropriate, you might have an anthropologist evaluate the value of preserving a culture who's more of an expert, or you might have individuals value, or you might combine them. So you might say, how much is it worth for you to preserve a culture that's sort of at this descriptive level of development? And then the anthropologist would be better at judging whether it actually meets those criteria or not. Okay, so when we finally get down to the information that we really do need to get from people, a natural approach is just to ask people. That approach has a long history. It's a very simple approach, and it's called contingent valuation, and it's usually done via surveys. You describe different situations. You ask individuals how much they'd be willing to pay to be in one situation versus the other. You impute this is their true willingness to pay, and you use that to do a cost-benefit analysis. So this is most commonly used for environmental issues, but it's also used in creating public transportation, in valuing public goods, et cetera. Okay, so Zianis is still not showing up to lectures, is he? No. Does anyone else want to give some examples of classic contingent valuation surveys? Yeah, Eric.
Trying to determine how much the Exxon Valdez oil spill destroyed the zone.
Yeah, so they tried to figure out how much the environmental damage that was done by that was worth to the people. So that's a very classic example. Preserving visibility at the Grand Canyon is another example of this. Preserving seals or whales in the ocean. Avoiding logging in national forests. Birds killed by Exxon Valdez. The value of preserving languages of an indigenous culture. Value of a new beautiful building in a city. So these types of surveys are done often by economists or other statisticians and are commissioned by regulatory agencies or by courts that are trying to figure out damages in a suit. These are basically ways of using benefit cost analysis for externalities, regulations, or decisions by government agencies, and the damages from various disasters. So these tend to be formal, money-based surveys, but there's also lots of informal things that are fundamentally similar to this. So anytime you have surveys of public opinion that influence politicians' decisions, effectively, that's a way of doing a contingent valuation survey. Now, they're not asking exactly numbers. They're just asking often directions. But in some sense, that has the same principle as the contingent valuation surveys. And had similar impacts on public policy. Yeah, go ahead, Chrissy.
So they also did contingent valuation surveys on preserving Louisiana's wetlands.
Yeah.
And for some reason, they surveyed people in Mississippi. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
because we're touching states, but a lot of people basically felt no value from the way that they phrased the questions
Yeah.
in the surveys.
Yeah.
And so people were underreporting what they might have seen
Yeah.
value placed on. So,
Yeah.
I mean, aside from just getting your wording right, I mean, because at some point it becomes like subjective or almost like propaganda when you're
Yeah.
phrasing to get people to care about a situation.
Yeah.
How can you really get
Well, so that's about what we were going to say on the next slide. So such surveys are in low repute among economists for some of the reasons related to what Chrissy was just saying. So is Il-Myung here? Il-Myung Huang? No? Okay. Chrissy, do you want to give some more thoughts about what might be problematic about these surveys?
Well, the responses are entirely subjective or they're not put in the right context for valuation. So if you ask somebody if they cared about some random bird species, they may have no knowledge, they may not care to look up in Wikipedia or Google what the bird is. They may not realize what the impact is.
Yeah.
So they thinking about it.
Yeah, so I mean, one simple reason is people just don't take these seriously. Honestly, would you? Like if someone came knocking on your door with one of these stupid things, like I would just blow it off, right? And if they said they were going to pay me $10 to answer it, I'd just randomly generate numbers and put them into the thing, right? Another thing is that people answer the wrong question often. So often people end up answering the question like, how much should society be willing to pay to preserve this thing? Not like, how much is it worth to me individually? Or they might just answer the question like, do I think the government has a role like getting involved with this stuff, and just say 0 if they think not, which is sort of what Chrissy was saying, right? Another thing is that people often don't have any idea what you're talking about, or any information or experience like valuing the relevant thing. So it takes a long time for people to figure out how much they value stuff, and like they've never thought about how much they value these sort of intangible random things. Another thing is that, as Chrissy was saying, is that a lot of this stuff is propaganda. So if you make people feel that they really should care about this, then they'll give you a big number. And if you make them feel like they shouldn't care about this, they'll give you a really low number. And it's all like about how the person who's surveying feels about them, or how good it makes them feel about themselves, right? Another problem is that often people's responses are completely inconsistent or apparently irrational. So they depend on like how you order the questions, or how you group them together, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes it very hard to interpret. And sort of the broader overall things is people have no real incentive to get anything right, and they have no experience doing this sort of stuff. So like, why would you expect it to make any sense?
But I mean,
yeah.
But at least, I mean, the incentives not aligned in a bad way, right? I mean.
Well, we'll talk about that in just one second.
Okay.
Okay, so actually, I think things are worse than this. I think incentives are misaligned. Yeah, go ahead, James.
I was going to say, like, this is all assuming that we design the survey with the best of intentions as well. Whereas this survey being done on the Louisiana wetlands getting conducted in Mississippi was probably part of all the corruption that entire incident was like mired in after the whole event. I mean, they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, if these things are manipulable, yeah.
This is written by like an experimental
Right,
economist
okay.
who just finished his PhD.
Oh,
I mean,
right,
he was very
enough.
well-meaning. I just
Fair
thought
enough.
his survey was terrible.
It's just whenever you hear all these polls and questionnaires, you always wonder who's written them. That's what it was.
Who's paying who's written them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's like a credible threat, which I didn't understand about this. It says, so if you put down this amount, you're going to get a letter later asking you to pay this amount.
I see.
So that people, I guess, wouldn't overestimate what they would pay, but that still seems like.
Yeah, but I mean, we know then that.
Yeah.
But Chrissy, we know then that your incentives would then actually be very strictly to be 0, because then you're in a public goods problem.
Yeah.
So that clearly is like the worst possible thing you could do in terms of incentives. So, okay, so what are the incentives in this situation? Well, it sort of depends what the survey is used for. So one possibility is that the people think that this is some blowhard survey that's not actually going to be used for anything of any significance. So what are people's incentives in that case? Is Jorn Bonke here? No? Anyone else want to say? Like, what are your incentives if you think this is some stupid piece of research that nobody's actually going to use it for anything? Yeah, Jim.
I mean, you might as well just say anything to get it over with.
Yeah, and who cares? I mean, like, why would you want to even try to tell the truth? Because it's not going to be used for anything anyways, right? So then this is clearly a terrible, terrible incentives in that case, right?
Basically, this approach doesn't sort of believe in the validity of cheap talk.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about, there's no theory of cheap talk, but you'd have to have one to, yeah.
Okay.
Now, the alternative is, what if you expect the survey to have a major impact on public policy? What would be your incentives then? Does anyone want to? Yeah, for Shank.
You would just over or underestimate depending on your political position.
Yeah. So someone who's right-wing and doesn't want anything to be done for the environment would say 0 on everything, right? Because even if they do have some small value about it, they think that whatever it is, it's like other people have way too high of a value, so they're just going to way underestimate. If you're left-wing and you'd say, oh, it's worth $100 billion to me, right? Because that'll skew the survey and get your policy preference to be implemented, right?